But that leads us into today's topic, which is the appraisal process. And coming into the studio today, guys, I got an email from one of my processors, and I had an appraisal come in low. So I know that you guys are going to touch on that a little bit, but let's get to it. Let's talk appraisals today.
Yeah, so, we've been talking the last couple of weeks about the home buying process in general. And if you've missed any of those shows, you can check out some of these segments by going to our Facebook page, Living in the 904, and we have those segments there. But, we've talked about the importance of getting pre-approved. And then once you're pre-approved, the house hunting process. And then from there, making and negotiating an offer. And then once you got a contract, we talked last week about working through inspections. And today we're talking about the appraisal process. So Mo, can you tell us what's an appraisal contingency?
Yeah, a contingency, the contracts when they're written, it comes contingent on an appraisal in most cases. The home must appraise at the value of the contract price. What that means for you as a buyer is you want to make sure that you're not overpaying for a home. So basically you want to make sure that you're paying fair value for the home that comes in at the price or higher. And it protects you and the lender. Right.
Yeah. So, why get an appraisal? Obviously, like Mo said, to make sure that you're getting the value there. But when you have a lender involved, when you're doing a mortgage, they require an appraisal. And the reason why is that they're lending you money, a lot of money on a house, and they want to make sure that it's a good investment for you to do that. So part of that process is confirming with an appraiser that the value is there.
Yeah. And who's paying for the appraisal? Well, typically it's negotiable. In most cases, 9 out of 10, I'd say the buyer is always the one that's paying for it. In this case, too, with the incentive for this month is, reach out to Vince, get a call. Right now, you can get a free appraisal, so take the opportunity. And you could do that by calling 904-877-1234.
And then, who picks the appraisal? When you got a loan involved, the lender, they want to pick the appraiser from a pool of, appraisals that they work with. And if you could just imagine the reasons why is just to make sure that somebody doesn't have their buddy out there, getting because a loan could be subject to an appraisal. So they don't want somebody coming out there that has a friend that's kind of helping with the numbers or something like that. So to avoid that possibility, although the buyer is typically paying for the appraisal, the lender would be the one that would be actually picking the appraiser.
Yeah, so what are comps? Comps are comparable properties. You want to, basically when you're writing a contract, you want to look at comps to make sure you're paying or writing an offer that's fairly close to what's selling out there. So you're looking for like properties for which you're about to put a contract in on.
Yeah, so when the appraiser, how does he establish the value? That's what he's looking at. He's looking at those comparable properties. Typically, I would say they need at least 3 good comparable properties. So if you could imagine if you're in a cookie cutter neighborhood, all the homes like say are very similar, and then you have 3 other homes that are just like your home that sold for a certain price. That's a really good indication of what your house should sell for in this current market. But sometimes there's unique properties that are harder than these cookie cutter situations. Sometimes you have, say I've had situations where there were homes like say on the river. And the other homes on the river nearby were not cookie cut. They weren't the same. So you have a really big, luxury style house next to a smaller kind of fishing style, home, and just all these different styles. And that's where it becomes a little bit more challenging. And so the appraiser is going to be trying to find the best possible comparable properties to compare the home to. Same thing with like historic homes. If you've got a historic like Spanish style home. And then some of the properties nearby are just different styles of homes. They're going to try to find as similar a property as possible. And when they can't, when there's differences, they're going to make adjustments for those differences. And so that's the idea is we're looking at what buyers are actually spending on the market, what's actually closed around you and similar properties. And that's how they're going to establish what's called the market value. But sometimes, we're saying how it's contingent on the home appraising. Mo, what happens when that appraisal does come in low?
So if the appraisal comes in low, everyone pretty much has an option. So the seller and buyer, typically, the seller can make the difference in price. So if a home is, under contract at $325 and it comes in appraised value at $315, the seller could drop the price point to $315. It just buyer can opt to pay the difference if the seller disagrees to pay the difference. The seller and buyer can both opt not to move forward in the contract. But I would definitely say more cases than not, the seller will be dropping the price to try to get the deal done.
Yeah, and sometimes, that example you just get, I got an example for what you just mentioned, how a buyer could pay the difference. I listed a property for a customer of mine, and the house was just fully decked out with a ton of upgrades, really nice home. And when we put it on the market, we had a full price offer within 2 hours of listing the property. It was really cool. It sold very quick. But when the appraisal came back, I want to say like $12,000 short. Came back about $12,000 short. And what I found is that the appraiser, he wasn't giving some of the adjustments for some of the upgrades that the house had. He was like, those upgrades are all good and well, but he wasn't assigning value for them to the property. But the seller saw the value, and the buyer also saw the value. And in that scenario, they actually agreed where they were going to split the difference. So the seller agreed to lower it by $6,000, and the buyer in that situation agreed to come up with the difference of $6,000 themselves to pay for that difference. So there's a lot of different scenarios that could happen there on how to overcome those situations. But another thing, when those appraisals come in low, sometimes there's a situation where there's an actual disagreement. An appraisal is an opinion of value from an appraiser. Now, they're professionals and they're very educated in the art of appraising, and they know what they're doing, but there's a certain level of a personal opinion when they're doing it. I mean, as an example, I'll just say two appraisers can give very different appraisal values on the same exact house. I've seen it happen multiple times. So sometimes there's a situation where we might be looking at that appraisal if it came in low, and the buyer and the seller and maybe the agents might be looking at it, and we actually disagree with the appraiser. And some of those examples could be if we look at the comps that are used and we're like, man, why did they use these comps in this other neighborhood when there's perfectly good comps in this neighborhood? Or maybe that there's a disagreement about how the house was measured. Maybe there's an addition and the appraiser's not counting that addition as part of the overall square footage. In those situations, we could potentially try to challenge the appraisal, and that's where we come with our notes. We come with the different comps that we're looking at, and we share those things to the lender and to the appraiser to try to make the case for why the appraisal may be off. And the lender and the appraiser can have the opportunity to review it. And if there's consideration or there's things pointed out that weren't considered the first time, the appraiser has the opportunity to make adjustments to that. Now, let's say that challenging it, the appraisal number doesn't get changed. As we said, there's multiple options of how that could be worked out. Seller could lower it, buyer can pay the difference. They can meet somewhere in the middle. Or what could happen sometimes is that it could just be a dead deal. If the seller doesn't want to drop the price, if the buyer doesn't want to pay the difference, then it could be a dead deal. And in those situations, like we said at the beginning, this is an appraisal contingency, and as long as the contract is written that way, then the buyer will not be at risk of losing their binder deposit funds that they put down at the beginning of the deal. Now, you would be out of pocket for the money you spent hiring an appraiser, because that's just paying them for that service. But the money that you put down as a binder deposit, that would be something that you would be able to get back.
And one of the things I want to bring up, too, is, when an appraisal leads to a repair requirement, they typically call it like a flagged issue. One thing you got to keep in mind, an appraiser is not an inspector, but they could be walking through their home and see things that need to be corrected prior to the lender approving that loan. An example would be they walk in the home, there's no appliances, or there's a missing appliance. They could flag it and for them to come back to the property to make sure that the appliances are there. They maybe walk in the property and find WDO issues, wood destroying organism issues, that they may flag on the report that may need to be corrected. So there's various things that could happen that the appraiser may see. Not necessarily, it's completely different from the home inspection report, happening at two different times. But for that loan to get cleared and to close, those repairs will have to be made prior to closing.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so the appraiser is not doing a full-on inspection, but if they notice, glaring issues and they put it in that appraisal report, sometimes that can be an issue for the loan underwriters. Vince, where does that typically come up with which types of loans?
It really depends. I mean, like you said, they're not doing a full-blown inspection, but
right.
they can put items on the report and they make the appraisal subject to.
Right.
Now, no lender can close on a subject to appraisal. The appraisal I mentioned to you earlier, it came in low, but they also noted appliances. I guess there's no appliances in this home. And I guess what happened is the seller's taking them out and replacing them, but at the time the appraiser went out there, he noted that and he has to do his job, and he put it on the report. So we have a subject to appraisal. And then usually what happens is once those corrections are made, we send the appraiser back out there to do a final inspection, and then we get a final appraisal that's cleared, and that's what our underwriters could typically use.
Yeah. Well, so we've talked about a couple different scenarios, why an appraisal is necessary, what the goal of an appraisal is to establish the value of the house that's being purchased. We talked about, comps and how an appraiser goes about trying to justify a purchase price, and then scenarios when the appraisal comes in low. Well, what happens when the appraisal comes in high? Well, what happens when the appraisal comes in too high?
That's great. I just keep that information to yourself.
Yeah, nothing happens. I mean, when the appraisal comes in high, as long as there wasn't some strange, weird thing written into the contract about a scenario like that, what usually happens is nothing. That just means that it's a happy day for the buyer. They know that they're buying a home and that there's like instant equity in there. The appraiser, and I've seen that happen before. Appraisal came back $10,000 more. And if I'm working with a buyer and then the seller's agent reaches out and says, "Hey, how'd the appraisal go?" And I just say, "We're good," and I just leave it at that. we're good, because you don't want to upset anybody or make them feel like they missed out on an opportunity. I mean, the deal between the buyer and seller was mutually agreed upon in the beginning, and then if appraiser comes in and he thinks that there's even more value than there, then that's just good. It just needs to come in at the purchase price or higher. So that's it. We're talking about appraisals today. We've been talking through the house hunting process. And then next week, we're going to get into more detail again about the loan process and loan processing. So make sure to tune in for that.